It doesn't have to be this way. So a plea to all the would-be terrorists that are out there. Hey, girl. Down on your luck?
It doesn't have to be like this. Imagine a room that at first looks ordinary. The cameras, the lights buzzing softly, a familiar presenter leaning forward with the kind of smirk that promises mischief. The audience breathes as one. In that stillness, a line is delivered, simple, surgical, and the room fractures. A laugh, a gasp. The internet, that vast echo chamber, ignites. What happened that night is less about a joke and more about a fracture in the story we had been told. For years, Meghan had been selling an image of reinvention. The outsider who pushed back against ossified institutions. The woman who turned pain into purpose and whose very presence in the corridors of royalty was supposed to recast history. She became a shorthand, resilience given a public face. But with a single, seemingly throwaway quip, the carefully choreographed narrative began to splinter. The joke landed not as cruelty but as recognition. It suggested something subtly different. That the armor of empowerment can sometimes look, in certain light, indistinguishable from dominance. And when that interpretation took hold, the people who had once been her staunchest defenders hesitated. They did not rise in indignation, they laughed. This is the twist that unnerves. Ridicule corrodes in a way outrage does not. Outrage is loud and finite. Ridicule is iterative and contagious. A headline burns brightly and then fades. A viral edit, though, stitched into looped videos, subtitled and reshared, feeds on itself. One laugh becomes 1,000, and the 1,000 echo until the original subject shrinks under the weight of repetition. It was not merely conservative commentators who laughed. It was the demographic that had nourished her brand. The progressive circles, the feminists, the social media savvy fans who had celebrated her as a symbol of modern resistance. When those people began to meme her, to stitch her documentary footage into a parody and pair it with a line that reduced her to control and performance, something shifted. The laughter came from inside the house. What Stewart said that night, a line comparing behavior to a well-known public persona from another country, was framed as satire. Satire has always been dangerous for those who travel in carefully manicured public lives because it reveals what people are already thinking but have not yet said. The power of the gag was not in inventing a new accusation. It was in articulating an old suspicion in a way that felt, perversely, like the final truth. Within minutes, short-form creators repurposed the bit. A clip paired with documentary footage. A stitched reel painted a pattern where previously there had been nuance. The soundbite reframed long-standing whispers. That the performative language of empowerment could double as managerial brusqueness. In this new light, the story stopped being only about palace cruelty and became about the mechanics of control. Publicists flapped. Behind the glass of the public relations war room, people debated strategy. Defend, dismiss, or ignore. Each option carried risk. To call it sexist could rally some allies but would alienate others who now found the joke apt. To dismiss it as mean-spirited would look increasingly tone-deaf when the joke kept replaying. To ignore it meant letting a narrative grow unchallenged, viral tendrils curling into every algorithm. Choice by choice, the attempt to staunch the leak made the wound worse. The more attention given to the reaction, the larger the story ballooned. And that is the peculiar cruelty of modern celebrity. Any push to correct the narrative can itself become the fuel that feeds it. The mimetic economy is unkind in its simplicity. A clever edit circulated showing a montage. Soft, earnest confessionals sliced together with images of an aloof gesture, a rolled eye, a clipped hand movement. Subtle gestures acquired symbolism. A smile suddenly looked rehearsed. A protective stance looked domineering. The internet is a mythical tribunal that demands icons become caricatures. Corporate partners noticed. Deals, once near certainties, were suddenly reviewed with a cold commercial calculus. Entertainment insiders murmured that projects had underwhelmed. An animated series quietly shelved. A lucrative podcast partnership ended earlier than planned. Deals once presented as surefire returned to the drawing board. Where once the media buzz was a virtuous halo, it now had the scent of diminishing returns. This cascade is not conjured from nothing. It relied upon existing levers. A record of public missteps, content that failed to land, and a perception that at times the messaging had been glossy without depth. The joke, mere words on a late-night set, did not invent these concerns. It amplified what had already been whispered in executive offices and private DMs. Yet, the heart of the matter is not merely commercial. It is intimately cultural. The moment revealed an uncomfortable question about authenticity in the age of platform-driven celebrity. When does the rhetoric of empowerment become a performance so tight it smothers the humanness beneath? When does a brand framed as restorative pride begin to resemble an iron-fisted manager calling the shots? To understand this, we must rewind and look at the stages of myth-making. First comes story, an origin tale polished to shine. Next, amplification. Platforms turn private pains into public narratives. Then, commodification. Everything that was once human is packaged into projects, IP, and partnerships. Finally, exhaustion. When every move is monetized, when every vulnerability is rehearsed and delivered as content, audiences begin to crave something less manufactured. And in that craving, satire finds traction. Satire thrives where there is a hunger for dissonance, where what is being sold is too tidy to feel true. It draws its power from irony, the space between what a public persona claims to be and what behavior reveals. What began as an offhand joke became a referendum on credibility. The story pivoted from the particularities of royal friction to a broader conversation about how public women, particularly women of color, navigate the fine line between being assertive and being labeled as overbearing. A conversation is fraught, layered, and ancient. It sits at the intersection of gender, race, and the media's appetite for simplification. The reaction from the progressive left is a study in complexity. Where once anger would have been automatic at any perceived slight, now there are calculations. Are we defending someone because she deserves defense, or because the optics of not doing so feel poisonous? When allies begin to doubt, you know the fissure has run deeper than the surface. Online, creators who ordinarily championed Meghan's cause found new angles for satire. Instead of an explicit conservative takedown, it became a kind of social media inquisition led by those who once saw her as emblematic of their politics. That turn is especially brutal because it reframes dissent not as ideological opposition, but as a betrayal from within the fold. The chorus of mockery is worse when it's sung with the voice of your own side. As the reels multiplied, the narrative hardened. Jokes mutated into metaphors, metaphors into memes, and memes into something close to cultural verdicts. There is a logic to this. Repetition creates pattern recognition, and pattern recognition becomes shorthand for truth. That shorthand then begins to influence decision-makers, executives, producers, advertisers, whose instincts are simple and calculating. Would this figure boost or diminish their brand? And so the business consequences followed. Projects that had been greenlit entered review. Deals once feted in glossy profiles now gestated in caution. A streaming executive leaked to the press that content had underperformed. Another suggested a podcast was more hollow than heroic. The public relations scaffolding that once protected myth-making began to creak. Crucially, this moment also exposes the fragile scaffolding behind influencer-era narratives. In an era where stories are curated for consumption, authenticity is both currency and liability. Audiences reward vulnerability, but they can be unforgiving when vulnerability starts to look contrived. There is a paradox at the heart of influencer culture. The more you attempt to own your pain, the more you set it up for interrogation when the seams show. Yet, we would be unkind to suggest the fallout is purely karmic. There are real human costs here. The person under the public microscope experiences collapse differently. Dismissal becomes personal. The algorithmic echo chambers translate into daily harassment, into jokes in places meant for solace. Whatever the truth of the jokes, people feel the sting in real life. And then there is the spectacle of PR. The management of public perception looks, from within, like triage. Statements drafted, talking points rehearsed, damage limitation memos circulated. Crisis teams weigh whether to lean into moral outrage, whether to call the bit sexist, whether to push back and present evidence of context. Each decision is tactical and every misstep can be amplified. Sometimes the attempt to explain becomes the admission that you are trying to manage a manufactured identity. The irony is sharp. The more carefully a public life is curated, the easier it is for comedy to puncture it. Comedy requires truth. It thrives on an audience's recognition that what is being presented as singular or heroic is in fact a composite, a performance shaped by advisors, media coaches, and market forces. A punchline becomes potent when it resonates with that recognition. In the days that followed, the studio laugh that had set everything in motion turned into an archaeological marker. People began to excavate. Old interviews were revisited and reframed. Tweets from years prior were dug up and placed beside new footage. Together, they created a palimpsest, a layered text where previous meanings were overwritten by new interpretations. This is how reputations shift, not through a single act of malice, but through accretion. One clip becomes 2, then 5, then 100. Once the narrative begins to stack, the architecture of perception rearranges itself around that new axis. Colleagues call, executives check their exposure, agents begin to hedge. But there is another, deeper story here about the gendered lens through which public behavior is read. When a man applies the same intensity, the response often diverges. He might be called decisive or visionary. She is cool. She is cool. It doesn't have to be this way. That was the quiet, almost pleading undertone beneath the laughter that would erupt and echo across screens worldwide. A plea not spoken directly to Meghan Markle, nor to Prince Harry, nor even to the studio audience sitting in that familiar late-night theater. It was, in a strange way, a plea to all those who thought they could control their story forever. A plea to all the would-be manipulators of image, the architects of narratives so polished that they begin to gleam unnaturally under the light. And yes, in its own ironic twist, it was a plea to every would-be terrorist of cultural credibility out there. Don't blow up your own empire by insisting on perfection, because perfection is the one thing the public never truly forgives. On a night that began like any other Daily Show episode, Jon Stewart leaned forward toward the camera, eyes narrowed with that mischievous glint, his smirk curling at just the right angle, and unleashed a line that detonated instantly across the internet. One moment, the room was filled with the usual rhythm of setup and punchline. The next, Stewart had carved out something sharper, something that didn't just bounce off the walls of the studio but sliced into the broader cultural bloodstream. "You were just hit so hard at the beginning with a lot of mistruths," he began, his timing deliberate, "that I made the choice to not read anything." He paused, letting the words settle, almost feigning a turn away from the subject. And then he dropped it. "Meghan Markle," he said, holding that pregnant silence just long enough for the audience to sense it coming, "is basically a mini Brigitte Macron, great at slapping her man into place." The explosion was immediate. The crowd roared. The laughter wasn't the polite, obligatory chuckle of an audience waiting for a cue light. It was volcanic, eruptive, a collective release of something unsaid. In that instant, Meghan Markle's carefully curated fortress of resilience, empowerment, and royal rebranding wasn't just nicked, it was pierced. "Oh, I've got my name, it's Jon Stewart. I've got a little picture going for you. What's happening? We've got a show tonight, my God." He riffed, riding the wave of laughter, but the damage was already done. Inside the studio, the eruption was deafening. Online, it was seismic. Memes, clips, and out-of-context one-liners flew across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram within minutes. The internet, so often divided into camps that fought to the death over Meghan, had found a new toy to play with. And the tone wasn't what anyone expected. Because here's why that moment mattered. Meghan Markle had spent years constructing an image of herself as more than an actress, more than a royal spouse, more than a tabloid headline. She was resilience personified, empowerment embodied, the survivor of palace cruelty who dared to speak truth to power. She had become the progressive voice railing against outdated institutions, the woman who claimed to have transformed personal pain into global purpose. She framed herself as the wronged outsider, the heroine reclaiming her dignity from the wolves. Do you watch royal dramas like The Crown or period spectacles like Bridgerton? Stewart asked rhetorically at one point, playing with the cultural zeitgeist. The audience nodded along. Yes, of course. And Stewart pounced. Bridgerton's glossy romanticization of aristocracy was one thing, but Meghan's ongoing Netflix saga was quite another. The brilliance of Stewart's joke wasn't that it was cruel, it wasn't that it was tabloid fodder. It was that it was cultural commentary cloaked in comedy. When he likened Meghan to Brigitte Macron, long cast in European press as the controlling spouse who publicly checked her husband, he wasn't gossiping. He was framing Meghan's empowerment as something that looked uncomfortably close to dominance. The joke landed not as a cheap shot but as a revelation, and that was the dagger. Memes sprouted instantly. One showed Meghan photoshopped beside Brigitte Macron with the caption, "Boss babes or bossy babes." Another stitched Prince Harry awkwardly attempting to hold Meghan's hand against the infamous Macron clip, where Brigitte brusquely pushed her husband's gesture aside. And here's where the punch truly twisted. The laughter wasn't coming from Meghan's usual critics this time. It was coming from progressives, feminists, and media-savvy fans, the very people who had built her brand into something untouchable. Behind palace walls, Meghan's defenders could always dismiss mockery as misogyny, as racism, as the same old recycled bigotry. But Stewart's line was immune to that defense. It wasn't about her skin, her gender, or her heritage. It was about her authenticity. And authenticity, once questioned, is the one currency no celebrity can afford to lose. That was the moment the scandal shifted gears. It stopped being tabloid chatter. It became a mainstream debate. Reports later suggested Meghan's team scrambled almost immediately. Anonymous insiders whispered to entertainment outlets that she viewed the joke as sexist, outdated, and deeply unfair. But that fury, in PR terms, was the real error. Because the second you take yourself too seriously in the face of comedy, you've already lost. The audience wasn't shocked at Stewart's words. They weren't gasping in outrage. They were laughing in recognition, as if he had finally voiced the thought they had been suppressing for months. Meghan's brand as the survivor, the empowerment figure, the modern royal, suddenly it all looked a little too rehearsed. Stewart reframed it as control, dominance, performance. And once a narrative slips from iconic to ironic, history shows it rarely comes back. Clips of the joke spread like wildfire. TikTok stitched Meghan's solemn, Netflix monologues with Brigitte Macron's icy hand brushing. Twitter threads captioned images of Harry trailing Meghan with lines like, "From Duchess to Dictator," or "Not empowerment, just management." The meme economy didn't just mock her, it dismantled her. And here's the part Meghan's team feared most. It wasn't conservative pundits fueling the fire. It wasn't Piers Morgan gleefully rubbing his hands. It was Meghan's own former supporters, the people who had once lauded her bravery, her glamour, her story. When your base begins to laugh at you, the battle is already lost. The irony of comedy is cruel. Outrage fades. Criticism can be weathered. But ridicule? Ridicule corrodes. It sticks because it feels true. A critical headline is forgotten by the next news cycle. But a viral joke repeats endlessly, embedded in the culture, whispered in every conversation. Industry insiders noticed quickly. Commentators observed that Stewart's bit wasn't just funny. It was devastating because it validated what Hollywood boardrooms were already whispering. Meghan's projects were slipping. Netflix had quietly axed Pearl, her animated series. Spotify had ended their multi-million-dollar deal, with one executive reportedly calling the output underwhelming. Even Confessions of a Female Founder, her supposed reset, had been received not as revolutionary but as generic, glossy, hollow. One critic summed it up with biting precision. Less like founders, more like flounders. Stewart didn't invent Meghan's decline. He accelerated it. His comedy worked because it tapped into a truth already circling among fans, investors, and critics. And once satire validates suspicion, a celebrity narrative rarely survives. Behind the gilded gates of Montecito, fury reportedly reigned. One insider claimed Meghan was humiliated, blindsided, betrayed. This wasn't Piers Morgan. This wasn't a right-wing tabloid. This was Jon Stewart. the very embodiment of the progressive, media-savvy camp she believed was her natural audience. If he was laughing at her, what did that say about everyone else? Her team debated endlessly behind closed doors. Should they call it sexist? Outdated? Xenophobic? Each strategy risked amplifying the joke further. Silence, too, was a gamble. Fans speculated her refusal to comment was calculated, an attempt to let the meme cycle die on its own. But every hour without a statement only allowed the clip to spread wider. Stewart hadn't just owned the news cycle for one night. He owned it for weeks. And then came the cruelest twist of all. Harry. The handbag joke resonated because it visualized what audiences had already begun to suspect. Prince Harry, once the rebel prince, once the soldier who broke away from palace protocol to marry for love, now looked like a man diminished, a background figure in his own life story. Public appearances confirmed the image. Meghan took the podium at charity galas. Harry stood silently behind. Meghan delivered speeches. Harry nodded politely. The once fiery figure was now a silent accessory, a living handbag. Critics didn't need to stretch. Stewart had crystallized what everyone saw, and Hollywood began pulling away, quietly at first, then more openly. Executives whispered about audience fatigue. Investors flagged the Sussex brand as risky. When your name generates more mockery than excitement, your currency isn't influence anymore. It's liability. Fans, once fiercely protective of Meghan, began turning. Online discussions shifted tone. It's giving Madonna in the late 90s, one wrote. Another, she's not Diana 2. 0, she's Kris Jenner 05. These weren't haters. They were former admirers, now exhausted by what felt like an endless performance. And that's the danger Stewart unleashed. Comedy works because it crystallizes the truth people already suspect. Repeat it often enough, and it becomes the truth itself. Meghan wasn't just fighting bad press anymore, she was fighting irrelevance. And irrelevance is the quiet killer of celebrity careers. Hollywood, once eager to cast Meghan as modern royalty, grew silent. Executives reevaluated projects. Sponsors hesitated. Progressive outlets that once defended her began covering her with neutrality instead of awe. And in the media economy, silence can be louder than criticism. The oxygen that sustained her brand, constant attention, was thinning. Here lies the irony. Meghan was once untouchable precisely because her story was bigger than her. She was the actress who challenged an institution older than democracy. She was the Duchess who looked Oprah in the eye and declared that palace insiders had tried to silence her. She was the mother reframing the royal family itself. But now, stripped of mystique, mocked by memes, diminished in public perception, she looked not like a movement but like another celebrity scrambling to cling to relevance in a brutal media cycle. And Harry? His fall was sharper still. Stewart's handbag punchline distilled an uncomfortable truth into one unforgettable image. The prince who had promised to protect his wife now looked like a sidekick in his own marriage. Memes compared him to Ken at the Barbie premiere, to the +1 Duchess. Viral edits placed him in the background of Meghan's interviews, holding purses, staring blankly. It wasn't hatred, it was ridicule. And ridicule erases sympathy faster than scandal ever could. Cultural historians were quick to point out the pattern. Once the public flips from iconic to ironic, there is no way back. Every new appearance, every podcast, every glossy Netflix show risks being dismissed as PR spin. Once laughter replaces admiration, the foundation collapses. Jon Stewart hadn't destroyed Meghan Markle. He had simply lit the match on a pile of kindling already laid. The failed deals, the hollow interviews, the relentless control of image. The fire spread because the audience was ready. And once the laughter began, it didn't stop. Which brings us to the cruel final irony. Meghan built her brand on controlling the narrative. Every interview, every photo, every podcast was curated, polished, approved. But comedy doesn't obey those rules. Comedy flips control into chaos. Comedy turns the polished into parody. It exposes the cracks that PR cannot plaster over. And that's why this wasn't just a punchline. It was a cultural turning point. Meghan and Harry weren't being debated anymore. They were being memed. And in a world obsessed with attention, being laughed at is better than being ignored. But not by much. So here's the question hanging in the air, unanswered. Can Meghan Markle rewrite her story one more time? Or has Jon Stewart's single punchline already written the ending? The question lingered in the air, heavier than any palace scandal, heavier even than the Netflix revelations that once felt so explosive. Could Meghan Markle, a woman who had so carefully crafted her public image, rewrite the script yet again? Could she pull herself back from the edge of ridicule, back into the realm of admiration? Or had Jon Stewart's comedic strike already sealed the chapter, perhaps even the book? Because make no mistake, comedy is more than entertainment. It's judgment, distilled. Stewart hadn't just made a joke, he had delivered a verdict. And it resonated because it echoed what millions were beginning to suspect. And that resonance is the most dangerous thing of all. Think about the mechanics of ridicule. Outrage sparks anger. Scandal sparks debate. But ridicule seeps into culture like dye into fabric. Once it spreads, the original color is gone forever. No matter how many apologies, no matter how many rebrands, the stain remains. People may not even remember the precise punchline, but they'll remember the laughter, the association, the sting. It is worth remembering, too, that Stewart's joke arrived at a moment of vulnerability for the Sussexes. Their brand, once fueled by righteous indignation, had been stumbling. Spotify had pulled the plug on their partnership. Netflix, while still bound contractually, was clearly hesitant. The grand narrative of liberation and empowerment had started to look like old news. And here was Stewart, not a right-wing firebrand, not a tabloid hack, but Jon Stewart, progressive royalty himself, suddenly turning the tide of laughter against them. The timing was catastrophic. In Hollywood, perception is currency. Studios don't invest in causes. They invest in stories that sell. For years, Meghan's story had been profitable. The brave outsider challenging the monarchy. A fairy tale turned nightmare turned inspiration. But Stewart's punchline cracked that story. It suggested not bravery, but bossiness. Not inspiration, but domination. It suggested that the heroine was perhaps the villain in disguise. And once that seed of doubt is planted, every new venture is shadowed by suspicion. Her Netflix specials were no longer just documentaries. They were vanity projects. Her podcasts were no longer empowerment platforms. They were self-indulgent monologues. Even her philanthropic appearances became suspect, as though every charity visit was less about the cause and more about the camera. Harry, of course, fared no better. In fact, he suffered more. Stewart's handbag quip was devastating precisely because it crystallized the unspoken. Audiences who once saw Harry as the rebel prince now saw him as the subdued spouse. He wasn't leading. He was following. He wasn't speaking. He was nodding. Once a soldier, now a symbol. And the memes, always the memes. Harry, carrying Meghan's handbag in a satirical edit, became more memorable than any speech he had given in recent years. The internet, ruthless as ever, had locked him in amber as the silent +1. Once you are reduced to a meme, you are no longer a man. You are a punchline. The palace, in its quiet way, must have smiled. They had tried to discredit Meghan and Harry through briefings, leaks, and counter-narratives. Yet, here was Jon Stewart accomplishing in 60 seconds what years of royal PR could not. He made the Sussexes laughable. And ridicule, far more than scandal, is what strips power from public figures. Consider how history remembers figures once untouchable. Sarah Palin wasn't destroyed by policy critique. She was destroyed by Tina Fey's parody. Bill Clinton's legacy wasn't undone by impeachment. It was undone by late-night jokes that forever linked him to scandal. Even Hillary Clinton, carefully managed and polished, couldn't survive the Saturday Night Live caricatures of robotic stiffness. Comedy does not just reflect culture, it reshapes it. And Meghan Markle, for all her control, for all her insistence on narrative, had no defense against that. Behind the closed doors of Montecito, insiders claim, the mood shifted from outrage to panic. Meetings with PR strategists intensified. Advisors debated whether Meghan should lean into the joke, laughing it off, or whether she should denounce it as sexist. Both paths were fraught. To laugh at it risked confirming it. To denounce it risked amplifying it. Either way, the meme cycle was beyond her reach. And in the end, the silence became its own statement. The clip continued to circulate. Late-night shows referenced it. Podcasts replayed it. Even international outlets covered it, framing it as a cultural turning point. Stewart, once Meghan's assumed ally, had delivered the blow that critics could never quite land. Hollywood executives noticed. The calculus shifted. Where once Meghan and Harry were seen as bankable stars, now they were liabilities. Projects stalled. Collaborations evaporated. Invitations to high-profile events grew fewer. The Sussexes, once the center of attention, began to feel the chill of cultural sidelining. And here lies the brutal truth of celebrity. Relevance is everything. Without it, the cameras stop clicking. Without it, the public stops caring. And once the public stops caring, there is no comeback. Yet Meghan, if nothing else, is resilient. Friends whispered that she doubled down on her efforts to reframe her image, exploring new avenues of storytelling, considering fresh projects. There were rumors of lifestyle brands, whispers of political ambitions, speculation about new media ventures. But all of it faced the same obstacle. The laughter had already lodged itself in the public imagination. Think of it this way. Every time Meghan appeared on screen, audiences remembered the joke. Every speech, every interview, every polished documentary carried the shadow of Stewart's punchline. The handbag. The domination. The control. The laugh track was invisible, but it was there. Harry, too, was caught in the trap. His memoir, Spare, once explosive, now felt diminished in hindsight. His accounts of palace cruelty and personal trauma, once riveting, were now overshadowed by the image of him as the subdued spouse. The prince had become the handbag, and no number of heartfelt pages could erase that. The tragedy, if you can call it that, is how preventable it all seemed. Had Meghan embraced authenticity rather than perfection, had she allowed vulnerability rather than control, the joke might never have landed. Audiences forgive flaws. They forgive missteps. What they don't forgive is performance that masquerades as sincerity. And Stewart's brilliance lay in exposing the performance. Was it fair? Perhaps not. Was it cruel? Undoubtedly. But fairness and cruelty have never been the measures of cultural survival. Perception is the measure, and perception had shifted irrevocably. So where does that leave Meghan Markle today? Stranded, perhaps, in that uncomfortable liminal space between fascination and irrelevance. Still famous, still powerful in name, but weakened in cultural impact. A figure once untouchable, now mocked. A heroine turned parody. And Harry? Once the rebel prince, now the quiet +1. A man reduced not by scandal, not by failure, but by ridicule. A prince turned handbag. The laughter continues. Softly, sometimes cruelly, but always persistently. It follows them into every project, every appearance, every whispered rumor. It cannot be silenced, because comedy, once unleashed, cannot be managed. And that is the ultimate irony. Meghan and Harry left the palace to escape control, to tell their own story. Yet, in chasing that freedom, they became prisoners of the one thing they could never master: the collective laughter of the public. Perhaps Meghan will reinvent herself again. Perhaps Harry will reclaim his voice. But the odds, as history shows, are slim. Once laughter defines you, it rarely lets go. So, when Jon Stewart leaned forward, smirk curling, and dropped that line, he wasn't just mocking Meghan Markle. He was writing her epitaph in the language of celebrity culture. Not scandal, not outrage, but ridicule. And ridicule, once embedded, outlives everything. It doesn't have to be this way. And yet, for Meghan Markle, it now is. Now is. This is Crown and Controversy, unraveling the royals, one scandal at a time. Don't forget to subscribe.